Good evening. I'm Bob Shrum, the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics, and our conversation tonight is in partnership with the Political Science Department. I have some quick announcements. First, we're hosting a conference this Monday, March 26th at Town and Gown from 9 a.m. to 3:30 on migration, immigration, and globalization. That will feature global experts, including former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, Clinton strategist Joel Benenson, and Mickey Kaus, who's a strong supporter of Donald Trump's immigration policies. Our next Tuesday panel will take place at the Wallace Annenberg Hall on April 10th. We'll be talking about the 2018 midterms, the first lap. And our final political conversation of the year on April 17th will be with Democratic strategist Donna Brazile here at Tommy's Place. Tonight's event is being broadcast on Facebook Live. And we're going to start in a little different way than we usually do. To give you a sense of that fateful year, maybe the year of greatest turmoil in modern American history 50 years ago, and the leaders who we're discussing tonight, I want to start with two short clips. First, let's look at Dr. Martin Luther King, who in March and April of 1968 had enlisted in the Memphis garbage workers' strike. Presumably, the technology will work.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over that. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, as he stepped out of his motel room at the Lorraine Motel, Dr. King was shot and killed. Robert Kennedy, the brother of President Kennedy, who was running for the Democratic presidential nomination against the incumbent President Lyndon Johnson and against Eugene McCarthy, who had entered earlier as another anti-war candidate, was headed for a rally in Indianapolis where the crowd was mostly African American. It wasn't the age of instant communication, and the folks in that crowd didn't know what had happened to Dr. King. The police said to Kennedy, "Don't go. It's too dangerous. There's going to be an enormous eruption. There are going to be riots," which there were, in fact, in cities all over the country. This is what Kennedy did instead after he got that advice.
Do they know about Martin Luther King?
We have left it up to your intellect that can be handled in this.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. And he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
So I wanted to start by giving you a sense of that night and what it was like. And 2 months later, of course, Robert Kennedy himself would be shot down and assassinated on the night he won the California primary. To discuss that extraordinary year, we have some extraordinary people. And Erica, will you take this microphone away from me? Thanks. My immediate left is the chairman of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, Mark Ridley-Thomas. I don't have sound? Okay, the chairman of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, Mark Ridley-Thomas, the former director of the Southern California SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization Dr. Martin Luther King founded, and someone who has sought to carry the King legacy out over the decades. Next, and I shouldn't need notes for this, Marylouise Oates was the Deputy National Press Secretary for Eugene McCarthy, the anti-Vietnam War senator who challenged Lyndon Johnson's renomination before Robert Kennedy entered the race. Later that year, she managed the successful congressional campaign of Allard Lowenstein, the founder of the Dump Johnson movement. She was a columnist for the LA Times later on and wrote Making Peace, a critically praised novel about the 1960s. I'm also lucky enough to say she's my wife. Bill Carrick is one of the nation's leading political consultants. Here in California, the chief strategist for Senator Dianne Feinstein and Mayor Eric Garcetti. He was political director for Senator Ted Kennedy. And as a teenager in South Carolina, he campaigned for Robert Kennedy. What you just saw there was an amazing moment. And there was no riot in Indianapolis that night, while, as I said, virtually every other American city except New York burned. My first question, and we can just go straight down here, is can you each give us a sense of that extraordinary year? Oates, you want to go first?
I think I've just been appointed. So that extraordinary, okay. A 1-minute introduction. I actually went to the March on Washington. I was 19. I had a summer internship job. The government had so much extra money, there were all these jobs that people all over the country came to D.C. It was the bonanza. You all missed that. I heard Dr. King speak. I participated, and I never... And I never said to myself, well, I should join the civil rights movement. I had friends going to Mississippi, both in 63 and 64, white undergraduates. No, I was going to be a journalist, and I became a journalist. I worked for United Press International for 3 years. I broke a White House embargo my 3rd year when I was in New York, and my career was over. I got involved in the anti-war movement. Still nothing to do with civil rights. And I had the theory that a lot of white people had. Once we got that war settled, we were going to be able to really take care of black problems, urban decay and education for black kids, which now I'm working for McCarthy. And in those days, we would have these little handouts. Remember those handouts? We had to get a picture on one side, and then you had 200 words about an issue. We're in New Hampshire, and Seymour Hersh, the famous Seymour Hersh, was the press secretary. I was his number 2.
Oh, see, hold that up to your mouth.
Pardon?
Hold it closer to your mouth.
Closer to my mouth? No? Then I get a bit.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me? Trust me, I can talk loud enough.
Oates, we need you.
We don't have a civil rights statement, and I'm getting battered day after day by the press corps. Why can't McCarthy speak out on civil rights? Now, this is February of 1968. We got a lot of stuff happening. Oh no, New Hampshire primary, people are all white. Who needs to have that? And then suddenly we're in Wisconsin. Hersh and I find out there's a rump meeting where they're going to discuss the issue stuff. We get there, and Sy is a very forceful reporter and a very forceful person. He says, is the statement on civil rights? And Curtis Gans, now dead, and I don't want to speak badly of the dead, but he was really a wishy-washy guy. Curtis Gans said, well, we've got 400,000 Polish Americans in the Milwaukee and the suburbs. They don't want to hear about black people. They don't want to hear about civil rights. At that moment, I understood, clarification, that all of this stuff was linked together. And if we didn't make an argument to link it together, we were going to get lost. I'm going to say one last thing and let the boys talk. Dr. King, and Mark can speak more, but Dr. King had one goal to 67 and into 68, besides the immediate goals of civil rights. He wanted to merge the fight for peace in Vietnam and the civil rights movement. He saw that as his mission. And I think for many of us, after his death, that became our mission too.
Mark.
Well, thanks. I'm delighted to be here and to participate in this conversation. On April the 4th of 1968, I was a 13-year-old middle school, then called junior high school student at George Washington Carver Junior High. And I have to say it was a turning point in my life. The milieu in which I was raised happened to have been the backyard, figuratively speaking, of Dr. King's headquarters in Los Angeles. Carver Junior High School was a stone's throw away from the Victory Baptist Church on 49th and McKinley, where the Reverend Arthur Atlas Peters was the pastor. They called him the shepherd. And it was that location where a lot of the organizing and base activity took place in this town. Los Angeles played a critical role in the civil rights movement, supporting Dr. King, largely because of the resources that were here. Los Angeles caused significant sums of money to support the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the 60s and well into the 70s and 80s when I led the organization here. And so it was a tumultuous moment in time. Los Angeles had just experienced its own convulsion in the form of, that is a social convulsion in the form of the, what was then called the Watts riots. We were still recuperating from that in many respects. You may recall that Dr. King came to visit Los Angeles to preach a word of nonviolence in that context. And so much was going on in 1968. At the point of his assassination, we learned what Robert F. Kennedy had to say, but there was someone else on the East Coast on a stage in an auditorium or a venue in Boston by the name of James Brown. James Brown was putting on a concert, and things were not beginning to go well, so the Godfather of Soul had to then be transformed into an ambassador of nonviolence and peace. And it was in that same context, several months later, that we had him come forth with one of his most famous songs, Say It Loud. Say It Loud. That was James Brown, 1968, the backdrop of Dr. King's assassination. And so I think it's important to realize there was a number of things going on politically a number of things going on ideologically. There were a number of things going on culturally. And this was a catalytic moment in many respects. And I remember it as being a life-changing moment. On the campus of Carver Junior High School, there was an outbreak of unrest on that campus, and there was an attempt to settle it down. I didn't fully understand all of what was going on, and the radio station called KGFJ, the magnificent monarchy, was on the air and wanted to make it clear that we needed to live the dream and honor Dr. King's life. And it was at that point in time that I became a devotee of nonviolence. And I maintain that posture to this very day. It was a transformative moment, one that I shall never, ever forget.
Bill?
I had a bird's eye view of the civil rights movement. I grew up in Aiken, South Carolina, and it was a tumultuous time. Dr. King was a dominant political colossus on the American landscape. What went on in Birmingham, what went on in Montgomery, what went on in Atlanta, the hospital strike in Charleston, the garbage bin strike in Memphis. He was there, and an active leader in the most dynamic way you can imagine. When you saw him on the film, you understand what a commanding speaker he was. And I thought they're both completely different speaking styles, Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. But what you saw is two men that didn't talk down to people, didn't pander to the lowest common denominator, talked aspirationally. Robert Kennedy quoting Greek poets. When we find a president who can quote poets again, maybe we'll understand that that doesn't have to be a unique and unusual experience. Dr. King not only talking directly about the Constitution in a real and live way to people in that audience, and they understood damn well what he was talking about. Nobody had to talk down to them to explain the Constitution, and nobody had to explain to them Scripture and the meaning of Scripture. So he was an incredible colossus. I'll give you two incidents from my childhood. The first 20 years of my life, I lived in the segregated South. And it was segregated, and there are people who would maintain it wasn't or whatever. It's not, none of that is true. My mother was active in politics. She worked in President Kennedy's campaign. And when the sit-ins started, which were students went to Woolworths, which was the big, we called them dime stores then, but it had a lunch counter where people would eat lunch in these small southern towns. But only white people. Black people could not sit at the counter. They could not eat there. So that became a focus. John Lewis became one of his initial leadership. That was part of it. In 1962, my mother was the president of the League of Women Voters in my hometown. She and a bunch of folks went, of her women friends, went to the Woolworths with, I'm not making this up, with their maids, sat down for lunch and gave their seats to the maids. They subsequently got arrested by the local idiot who was a police officer. They didn't last nobody stayed in jail very long because the city attorney was also the Democratic boss for the town. So he came and told the policeman, he'll be lucky to have a job in the morning and you better get all these ladies out of here now. And you don't ever do this again. We're not Alabama. We're not Mississippi. And so that was like a profound experience because it was like this thing that was on TV was actual real and live and impacting people very directly. To Mark's reference to James Brown and an incredible thing he did in Boston, which really kept the peace in a very volatile and racially polarized city at that time. Later that year, same year, I went with some friends to see James Brown concert. Now, this is the complexity of the South. There were a bunch of Southerners that liked R&B music, soul music, listened to African American stations, and meanwhile, everything's segregated, but it makes no sense, of course. But that was the reality. So the Bell Auditorium in Augusta, Georgia was segregated. It was the one entertainment venue, large entertainment venue. The bottom floor, if you had white acts, would be where the white people sat. And the African-American folks sat up in the balcony. Now, that reversed itself when you had African-American acts. So the African-American audience would be on the bottom floor and the white folks would be in the balcony. So James was there one night with the Flames, and it was, the place was going crazy. Everybody was going nuts. And so the black folks on the bottom started waving at the white folks to come down. So all these white people come pouring out of the balcony of the Bell Auditorium, and everybody is on the floor together. And that was James Brown. That was what was going on. It was an incredibly impactful time because it was an experience that millions and millions of Americans had personally. It wasn't just some abstract thing on cable TV or anything like that. It was in your life. And you were experiencing it.
I'm going to return to the politics of that year in a moment, but Mark, I want to ask you, what difference would it have made if Dr. King had lived?
Well, I think the project on which Dr. King was working at the time, in addition to what Oates indicated, the civil rights agenda explicitly, on the peace movement explicitly, trying to reconcile those two. The big ticket item that took him to Memphis was the civil rights, economic justice issue, the dignity of working men and women. But it was the poor people's campaign. The contradictions of being in a nation of wealth and the backdrop of impoverishment that just would not relent. He became an increasing critic of capitalism as it had presented itself in that context. Concerned about children. I had a conversation with Marion Wright Edelman, one of his colleagues, acolytes at the time, who essentially wanted to make sure that the movement could go forward. And it was in that context that, frankly, both Dr. King and Robert Kennedy began to have much more of an appreciation for each other, and we'll talk about that a little more. But had he lived, I think his very bearing and presence, talk about a charismatic figure, would have enlivened the discussion about poverty. 25 million people in poverty in America at the time, literally twice that many impoverished in America now. And to the extent to which that was the case, I think it's very clear that movement politics would have been very, very different than what we've seen subsequent to his death.
Bill, a corresponding question for you. What do you think might or would have happened if Robert Kennedy had not been assassinated? What would have happened if Robert Kennedy had not been assassinated?
I think that what Mark alluded to is that there was a convergence of the King agenda, if you will, with the anti-war agenda, and Bobby Kennedy was kind of the bridge in that dynamic. It is hard to imagine now that somebody, a U.S. senator, a presidential candidate, would have on his campaign agenda a visit to literally the poorest white people in America in eastern Kentucky, would go to the Mississippi Delta, visit with the poorest African-American people in America, would visit Cesar Chavez when he was organizing the farm workers against all kinds of local hostility. There's fabulous footage from that day with Robert Kennedy explaining to the local sheriff what the meaning of the Constitution was. That, I think we would have had more convergence of the agendas. I think we would have had Robert Kennedy in the Indiana primary, which he later won in 1968. He was getting votes from African Americans in Gary and Indianapolis in very large percentage. And he was also winning the votes of working class white voters in counties that had largely supported George Wallace. So it was a unique coalition that he was beginning to assemble. And it does echo off our last election when we failed to win the same number of white working class voters with Hillary Clinton in 2016 that we had twice won with President Obama. So, I mean, that reality of building coalitions that unite people, not only socially but economically, is still with us, and it is still a challenge, particularly for those of us who are Democrats.
So, Oates, where were you the night Robert Kennedy was assassinated?
This seems unreal to me, even when I talk about it. So 50 years ago, I'm running this campaign for the guy, Al Lowenstein, and he had been a McCarthy person, but he wanted to move over to Bobby.
He had founded the Dump Johnson
He had founded the Dump
movement,
Johnson thing. He basically had gone off, and he had asked Bobby to run as an anti-war candidate against Johnson, and Bobby said no. He got Gene McCarthy, which was kind of a wishy-washy guy from Minnesota. He wanted to quote Greeks too, but he got the quotes wrong all the time. So I'm sitting in Al Lowenstein's house in Long Beach, New York, right? And I'm sitting there with a couple other workers and Robert Wagner, the guy who was a big star. He was on The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And we are waiting for Bobby to call Al and tell him what day he's going to campaign with him. And we're sitting there and we're watching the TV, and Al said, I'm going to bed. He said, just get me up when he's on the phone. And we're there, and Wagner had been out. Robert Vaughn had been out campaigning for Bobby, so he was very close. We're watching, and all of a sudden, the shots happened. Now, our age, we'd all been through JFK. We'd been through Dr. King. And this was the ultimate televised assassination. As we know, the guy who did this, Fred Dutton, decided to bring him through for safety, the kitchen, and there was the guy, Saran, looking like a busboy. Everyone was devastated. The McCarthy and the Kennedy people hated each other. The McCarthy people were very self-righteous. I had already quit, so I'd left that behind. They had buttons made after McCarthy allegedly won, which he did, 40%, and it was a win in New Hampshire, that said FMBNH for McCarthy before New Hampshire. I want to talk about an exclusionary button? That's an exclusionary button. So the question was, could you bring people together? And the answer was, you couldn't. That people were so angry, the McCarthy people, that Bobby had decided to run and challenge Gene, as well as Lyndon Johnson by this stage had dropped out. It was such a feeling of deep frustration. So in the fall, I went to Berkeley, not to be a student, but to be the journalist in residence for the Daily Californian. And that's when we had the social analysis 139X. And I do think that this is a key thing. This is how far we move in 6 months. We have Eldridge Cleaver of the Panthers, who's written a book called Soul on Ice, and they had a participatory education thing. People could come up with courses, and you could do anything. But the amount of furor that this raised in the state of California, that a Black Panther was actually going to teach. And the Panthers had started in Oakland, I guess 2 years before, right, as a breakfast feeding program. Now, they did have a problem in branding. They wore black leather jackets, they carried rifles, and they had big bandoleros of ammunition. It was not like a, let's join together and solve this problem. But it seemed perfectly logical in some ways because of the terrible anger that people felt, terrible frustration, and all the while, and you have to always remember this, the war is there and people your age are getting drafted in enormous numbers. Remember, we lost 55,000 Americans in Vietnam, dead, and we lost 450,000 Vietnamese, dead. And so I think that now the problems that you face are so immediate. What's happening with Trump? What's happening with the world? Is he going to go on the terrorist tour? Is he going to go to see Putin? But in a strange way, we all thought we could solve these problems. We thought we could really bring about social change, didn't we? Yes?
Let me pull this back. I want to do a follow-up for each of you. Bill, after California, the New York primary was coming. It was the one primary that Hubert Humphrey, who ultimately became the nominee, could not skip. He waited to announce after Johnson withdrew, and Johnson withdrew after just before Dr. King's death. He waited to announce until all the primary deadlines had passed, but he couldn't get out of being in the New York primary. If the party bosses would never have accepted McCarthy, and they then controlled the nomination, what if Kennedy had overwhelmingly, as appeared likely, won the New York primary? Would that have made a difference?
Well, can I do a little prologue here? 1968, delegates, now we know how delegates are selected. They're largely selected in primaries, and they're pledged to a candidate. In 1968, there were far fewer primaries around the country. There were still a lot of state parties that were controlled not only with the caucuses as we understand them, there were some of those, but there were also some states where the governor would just appoint all the delegates to the national convention. So there wasn't a lot of small d democracy in the system. It was sort of rigged for the establishment from beginning to end. And having a sitting president in the White House made that a big deal. Vice President Humphrey ultimately didn't run in any primaries. Did he run in?
He was in New York.
He was in New York, but he skipped all the primaries but one. And so he was not on the ballot anywhere. He was being selected by state party committees, or literally the governor doing it, or sometimes they'd have some state conventions, whatnot. It was backroom politics, and it was the sort of end of that era because it became a catalyst for massive reform of the whole process. Now, to the question Bob raises, the interesting thing about Senator Robert Kennedy's candidacy is there was a comfort level with him with many establishment figures that Gene McCarthy could never have accomplished, because he was both, a passionate candidate and a catalytic candidate for change. But before that, he had been a campaign manager for his brother in 1960. So a lot of the inside players and power brokers in the Democratic Party had a relationship with him all over the country. So he had an advantage if that process, if we'd ever gotten to the point where people decided they were going to move beyond Humphrey and another choice because Senator Kennedy was a more attractive electoral choice than Vice President Humphrey. Vice President Humphrey went through the campaign. The campaign ended up being very close, but he literally had months where his candidacy was stalled. Literally, a worst convention in the history of American politics was in 1968 in Chicago. He came out of there looking weak and embattled. If Robert Kennedy had lived, I think there was a chance that he could have been the nominee. And as we found out, even after he was assassinated, his brother, Senator Ted Kennedy, was being enticed to get in the race at the last minute by people like Mayor Daley in Chicago, who purported to, we don't know for sure, we think we know, but he purported to be speaking for Governor Connolly in Texas to say, look, we'll dump Hubert if Ted will run. So there was a lot of reason and rationale for Robert Kennedy candidacy, even though he was on the outside of the power structure around Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, Mark, I want to follow up with you because you mentioned this. How did Kennedy achieve such overwhelming support from African Americans and build that relationship with Dr. King, given that as Attorney General he had agreed, however reluctantly under pressure from J. Edgar Hoover, to the wiretapping of Dr. King?
Well, these are interesting questions and complicated historical facts to some extent. Let me just offer a bit more about 1968 and quickly move to the answer. Be mindful of the fact that in 1963, the president had been assassinated, John F. Kennedy. In 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated, hardly an irrelevant piece. And then in 1968, how many of you know the name Malcolm X at all? All right. That's a good thing to know. And if you dive into the autobiography of Malcolm X written by Alex Haley with Malcolm X, you'll find deep insights. 1965, he was assassinated. 1968, Dr. King and Robert Kennedy. And so a turbulent, unprecedented level of violence aimed at leaders in the nation. A couple of other points worth mentioning. First, it was projected, speculated that had Dr. King lived, Hubert Humphrey would have been more viable as a candidate. It's an interesting point of view, but not an uncommon one expressed. And certainly, it's often argued had Robert Kennedy lived, Richard Nixon would never have been president. And so there's a lot of speculation and projection along those lines. To some extent, Bob, I think your earlier point about the lack of the rapidity of information being shared had a lot to do with the impression that African Americans may have had about Robert Kennedy, and he benefited from the image of his brother, who was assassinated almost 5 years earlier. In other words, what I think had already begun was the Kennedy aura and the extent to which he had the opportunity to cash in, if you will, on that. I do not believe that it was fully known that he was a King detractor, both mechanically and politically. I think there was a lot in play with respect to trying to build unity in the Democratic Party on that which would be conceived of as the more liberal end. Therefore, the work that Robert Kennedy had begun to do, as indicated by a bill in the Delta and elsewhere on poverty. Marion Wright Edelman made the point that she went by in the summer of 1967, found herself in Atlanta, Georgia, at the headquarters of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She saw Dr. King there, and he looked exhausted and depressed, and somehow Marion said to him, just saw Robert Kennedy, and he wanted me to give you a message. that he wanted you to bring that Poor People's Campaign to the nation's capital. And somehow, Marion documents in her letter to Dr. King that she wrote some 49 years later, that would have been last year, that Coretta, his wife, said his spirits were lifted. And there was a new level of energy that came forth because of the impression that was given that there could be collaboration. And so the convergence of this new level of consciousness that the Attorney General had been able to find his way to, and the penetrating area of declaring war on poverty, not the war on drugs, but the war on poverty that Dr. King was trying to move forward, made for this impression. And African Americans needing and wanting to have standing and strategic alliances made for this impression about RFK and MLK. I don't know that it had as much depth as one might have hoped, because obviously they didn't have sufficient time to work all of that through.
I'm going to turn this over to the audience questions. I just want to say that, in my view, 68, even more than 63, was a turning point when we learned the mortal dangers of American public life, and the country went in a very different direction than it otherwise might have.
Right.
It's hard for those of us who were alive then to realize that it was 50 years ago. Both those assassinations are two of my most vivid and, to be honest, saddest memories. Now let me open this up to questions.
Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Amir. I'm from Seattle. With you guys' level of wisdom and what you see going on in the world right now, in your opinion, I would like to hear from all four of you guys. What do you think we have to do at our age? Actually, no. What do you guys see happening at your level of wisdom in the next few years during this term of presidency?
I want to go back to your original question. If everybody here doesn't vote, it's your fault. If everybody here is not registered, and I think you can all register here, but if you're from some place where there's really toss-up elections, you need to go home and register. And you need to get an absentee ballot, because these congressional races are going to be the huge difference in November. I mean, there's so many places that could be red until blue. And I do want to say one thing to Mark. In the many jobs I had in 68, I did a series for the National Catholic Reporter on the Poor People's Campaign. Yeah. And because Dr. King had been assassinated, and because people's spirits were so low, it was a disaster. I mean, political people wouldn't come down from Capitol Hill. They had tents all over the hill, all over the mall.
Resurrection City.
Pardon? Oh, Resurrection City. It was a nightmare. But on June 19th, there was a commemoration of the march from 1963. And I was lucky enough to be backstage with the famous Al Lowenstein, who himself was murdered in 1980, assassinated by someone who thought that Al had his teeth rewired for the CIA. It was a crazy time. But we're standing back there, and I looked out, and the mall was filled with both black and white people. And that, to me, was the kind of going on point, not whether or not the Poor People's Campaign had worked, or whether or not everything we tried to do that year had worked, but the fact that it was a mixed group. One last thing, and then I'm going to say more. People say to me, I taught about women's political stuff at NYU, and people say to me, well, how about the women's movement in 1968? Oh, hell, there wasn't one. There was nothing. I mean, there were a few feminists, but they had nothing to do with politics or anything. So I do think that the gift to women from the civil rights movement and from that turbulent year is the women's movement.
Well, something happened in 1968 at Yale in terms of women, and That's a documentable fact that's important. I think it was 1970. They gave it 68. 2 years later, were you there then? When did you? Yeah.
Let's see.
I was there for the Panther trial in 70.
Okay.
But when were you at the Divinity School?
I was at the Divinity School from the spring of 71 to the spring of 73. Yale was very kind. I have no undergraduate degree, and I have a master's in divinity.
Isn't that wonderful? Don't try that. Whatever
Don't try
you do.
it.
I'm telling you
You
that
got to
right
kind of
now.
slip in the back door.
And so, what about now? I'll just say it a little differently, if I may. If you don't vote on Tuesday, don't complain on Wednesday. It's just that simple. And if you aren't registered to vote, I'm prepared to register you to vote tonight and hereby deputize you. It's a fundamental act of what it means to be a citizen, to exercise your right to vote. Since we're talking about Martin Luther King, be mindful of the fact there are those who fought, bled, and died so that we might enjoy the benefits of democracy and the right to vote. Someone said Selma was a turning point, 1965. Bloody Sunday and Turnaround Tuesday. These are historical facts that we should never, ever forget. So what should we do? The millennials have such tremendous capacity in terms of impacting turnout. And through the African American Voter Registration, Education, and Participation project that will reach beyond African Americans in the county of Los Angeles, well into the state of California, we're going to be talking to millennials. And so there's an opportunity for you to get hooked up, connected, and do what needs to be done. To be politically inactive is not in your self-interest. If you don't believe that, just visit 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
To answer the second part of your question with one sentence, I said earlier that 68 was the most tumultuous year in the last 50. I think the next several years could be very tense and very difficult, and there could be a number of crises. Hopefully, and hope to God, no one gets killed.
I just say that everybody's saying the most important thing, vote and participate. But here's the reality. Midterms are, by their very nature, low turnout elections.
Yeah.
Not as many people vote historically in a midterm than vote in a presidential. That is an opportunity. This last election, 2016, here in California, millennials were 25% of the electorate. People 65 and older were 25% of the electorate. That's an astonishing amount of progress. But I'm greedy as a political consultant, strategist. I know there's a lot more millennials out there who haven't registered to vote, who aren't participating, because this is one hell of an opportunity, this election right now. And you know, this is not the presidential election. We're going to win or lose control of the House in California, in New York, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Those are the big pockets of seats we can win. And these seats here and in Southern California are ground zero in the fight to get a majority of Democrats in charge of the House of Representatives. And if you share our belief that that's a good idea, you just got to make sure you participate, your friends participate, and everybody is involved, because we have an opportunity. Republicans did this in 2010 as President Obama got elected in 2008. We passed Obamacare in that next Congress, and then the Republicans came back and wiped us out.
Mm-hmm.
We have the opportunity to do that in this midterm.
One coda to that, Bill saying we, I want to just say that whatever side you're on, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, you're going to determine the future if you decide to get involved and if you decide to vote. And that's what I suspect everybody up here is saying.
Effectively. Agreed.
We have another question?
Hi, my name is Oscar. I think that we all saw in that first clip just how genuine Robert Kennedy seemed about the civil rights movement. And in fact, after Dr. King was shot, John Lewis said, we may have lost Dr. King, but we still have Robert Kennedy. So how can politicians today kind of convey that same sense of genuine? Because I feel like that's kind of lost today. Or do you see any politicians who are genuine in the sense that Robert Kennedy was?
I have one. And you can find him on YouTube. You can see him on the thing. His name is Kennedy too. His name is Joseph Kennedy III. He's the congressman from Massachusetts. Went to Stanford, but besides that, he's a really great guy. I think that he's somebody, and he's also closer to your age than he is to mine. So I think he's much more relatable. I think another difference is that we now have someone like John Lewis in the Congress. So that relationship's never going to be the same, because we now have someone who is a powerful African American who speaks not just for African Americans, but for social justice everywhere. And that's a little different there.
But the briefest answer I could give to that is the best way to be authentic is to be authentic, not to try to figure out how to sound like you're authentic or like you're real. And there are folks in the Democratic Party, Oates mentioned one, Joe Biden would obviously be another. I mean, I think perhaps Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders came from nowhere to do well, partly because people thought he was authentic. And there are folks, whether you ideologically agree with them or not, in the Republican Party who have that same capacity to get up, to move people, and I think one of the surprising reemergences you're going to see is Mitt Romney, who after he gets elected to the Senate in Utah, and he will get elected, is going to be a very powerful voice inside the Republican Party. And I think because he's not running for president and because all that's passed, he will come across as kind of an authentic and honest figure.
May I offer the notion that authenticity is not a static phenomenon. Being an elected official, call it a politician, in 1968 is qualitatively different than being an elected official in 2018. The way you campaign, your level of exposure, and a whole range of other things helps to redefine what politics happens to be and how you project yourself to a constituency. I would argue it's very, very different. Some would say, well, what's real is real. Either you are or you are not. The televisual impact, the social media dimension, all of those factors, the influence of capital in the political sphere make this a qualitatively different proposition. I'll leave it at that at this moment, but I'd be more than glad to explore that more deeply with you.
We have time for another question, so.
Hi, I'm Grace Steele. With great leaders like history, MLK was a socialist at best, anti-capitalist in general. Albert Einstein was a socialist, Nelson Mandela was pro-Palestine. We forget these things as history goes on, and history picks and chooses what to decide to be. Republicans now will post things about MLK, and it's well, MLK would have probably hated you, because you're a capitalist. But where do you see, how big was anti-capitalism to the 1960s movements in general with RFK and MLK, and where do you see those movements continuing now? Because I feel like they've been kind of left behind in forever.
Who was a commie?
What?
Saying who was a commie? I mean,
No, she's saying they were socialists, and that's been forgotten.
Or just anti-capitalist in general.
Martin Luther King was. I think Mark said it right. What Dr. King was objecting to was the depredations and excesses of capitalism. He wasn't trying necessarily to overthrow the whole system. Bernie Sanders says he's a socialist, but then he says he's a democratic socialist who wants to deal with wealth inequality, but is not trying to overthrow the whole system and have, for example, the government own every company. I suspect that Dr. King, who was idealistic but pretty practical, would have thought that that was not something that could be achieved or that should be central to his fight. But you're absolutely right. I mean, look, the Pope is saying things very similar now to what Dr. King said about the excesses of capitalism and about wealth inequality.
But it's profoundly rooted in his sense of being a Christian, and trained as a systematic theologian, and he thought the notion of wealth in that manner, the excesses, as Bob referred to, and the manifestation of poverty diminished and or demeaned the dignity of human beings, and we had ample examples of that. And so what he wanted to essentially say is that this represented another form of violence. So this was economic violence that he was essentially bringing critique to bear. And so corporate wealth and the rigors of capitalism as it created huge disparities and income inequality, etc. That's where his critique was most sharply aimed. But fundamentally devout and wanted to elevate the dignity and worth of every human being created in the image and likeness of God. That's where he was. To say him otherwise may be to mischaracterize the terrain in which he located himself.
Hard to believe, but there was actually a very, very vibrant organization around the country called National Welfare Rights.
Right.
And it was big in Boston, where all the welfare mothers were white. And led by a terrific guy named Dr. George Wiley, who had been a chemist and who taught at Cornell, and who was African American. And they actually pressured George McGovern in the 1972 campaign of saying that he wanted a guaranteed annual income for all American, $1,000.
Yes, until we changed it because we were on our way to losing 49 states. And people thought that that was, to be honest, too extreme. The truth is, we may be heading towards something like that in the age of automation and artificial intelligence. That's a big debate, and maybe for another night. Bill, you wanted to say something?
Well, I think the one thing we have to remember about Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, even though they were taken from us far too early, they left a lot of disciples. They had lots of people that who spent the last 50 years trying to fulfill their commitments. And that is a powerful influence. George McGovern is one of them who did many wonderful things on hunger. My old home state senator Fritz Hollings was a great friend of Bobby Kennedy's, and he did lots of good things on hunger. There were a lot of people who were disciples, and I think it's also you got to be careful about putting people in these boxes 50 years later, because Robert Kennedy is very innovative about getting private sector dollars into Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York, which was one of the worst pockets of urban poverty in the history of the country. So, I mean, he got the Ford Foundation in there. He got things. There was a lot of creativity in both Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, and a willingness to think outside the box on things all over the place. Now, Dr. King, obviously, as a serious Christian, was trying to fulfill his view of the world as a preacher and as a Christian, but he also was a very practical guy, practically politically and practical in terms of the struggles he took on. You know, he deliberately started the civil rights movement in the South and then moved north, because he knew if you put a magnifying glass on the South, the country would react negatively to it. And then he could take and broaden the struggle to the North and the West. But he was a very smart strategist.
We're going to conclude, I think. It's, as I said earlier, hard to believe it was 50 years ago, and I thought we should look back, commemorate it, so to speak, and at least give you some sense of what it was like and what was happening. I want to thank everyone on the panel, Mark, Marylouise, Bill. I want to thank our staff who worked very hard. You guys on the panel, by the way, gave a very vivid sense of what that year was like. And I want to thank all of you who joined us in person after spring break, and all of you who joined us on Facebook as well. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you April 10th to talk about the midterms. Thank you.